And we're very excited to have you today to our webinar where we will explore how a rights-based economy can challenge the neoliberal model through an intersectional lens, with colleagues joining us from human rights, economic justice, and feminist movement. Before we begin, I would like to make sure you all have access to interpretation channel. As Maria mentioned before, you can toggle the globe channel at the end of the Zoom application tab below. And I have a question for you all to start with, and that is what is right-based economy, or what does rights-based economy means to you? You can answer that question very briefly in one sentence in the chat box. So without further ado, I would like to welcome, to start the webinar formally, I would like to welcome CSR Executive Director Maria Balsera to give us the opening input and start the webinar by answering the question around what is rights-based economy and how it differs from traditional economic model. Dr. Maria Balsera is the Executive Director at CSR. She is a feminist leader with a proven commitment to collaborative research and advocacy, as demonstrated through her work with national, regional, and international coalitions in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Welcome, Maria. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alina. So the question about what's a rights-based economy, at CSR, within that, a rights-based economy is based on a holistic understanding of human well-being and supported by the widely agreed framework of values and obligations of human rights. It demands actions to redistribute resources, remedy inequalities, and rebalance powers in our economies. The RBE has been proposed not to crowd out other progressive alternative visions for how our economic system could and should work, but rather to crowd in those visions, to learn from them and build on them. Indeed, in the initial outlining of the rights-based economy, we drew from some ideas like buen vivir, the well-being economy, the feminist economy, the caring economy, the growth, and more. But a distinguishing feature of the RBE from other models is that it is underpinned by human rights standards and principles, as outlined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international and regional human rights treaties, and other instruments. CSR has been exploring collaboratively with partners and allies how a human rights framework can enrich visions of economic justice, bringing movements together to create a blueprint for a rights-based economy. But the basic question is, what is the economy for? We don't often stop to ask this question. Economies shape how we organize societies and how widely rights are enjoyed. But the economy is often talked about as a monolithic force that cannot be controlled and which is separate from the day-to-day lives of humans. It is depicted as a number on a chart, the GDP, or the rise and fall of the stock market. We often talk about the need for austerity, having to sacrifice health or education or other rights in service of the economy, to repay debt, to control inflation, etc. But in reality, people are the economy. For this reason, we all have the right to ask and answer the question of what the economy is for and who it serves. We are living in an era of unprecedented wealth, with resources that could allow everyone on the planet to flourish. However, the neoliberal economic system, built to favor only a few, has created or exacerbated multiple crises: climate breakdown, extreme inequality and debt crisis, insecurity, feminization of poverty, you name it. The economy reproduces discrimination and structural inequalities, with income, wealth, and opportunity gaps manifesting along lines of race, class, gender. The devastating impact of climate change are increasingly felt in the global south and accumulating among the poorest communities, especially communities of color. Colonialism entrenched patterns of environmental and labor exploitation that widen economic disparities between countries and persist to this day. At CSR, we believe this moment is ripe for mobilization for systemic and radical change, to promote a rights-based economy, an economic model that firmly prioritizes human rights over profit and that works both for people and the planet. There are 5 key pillars that we believe are crucial objectives of the elements of the RBE. 1, guaranteeing dignity and well-being for all at all stages of life, ensuring that every person has access to the goods and services necessary to thrive, such as education, housing, healthcare, food, or water. 2, pursuing substantive equality, particularly gender equality, dismantling intersectional inequalities and systems of oppression by addressing historical legacies and drivers of structural inequality and creating greater equity in opportunities and outcomes. 3, tackling power imbalances in the economy, fundamentally shifting power from corporations to communities and rewriting the rules which make the playing field so uneven. 4, working in harmony with nature, not exploiting it, pursuing a developmental pathway which values the intrinsic worth of nature and nurtures respect for the Earth's natural system, learning from indigenous knowledge and practices. And 5, democratizing and decolonizing the global economy, radically transforming institutions and systems of global economic governance to overturn asymmetries between the global north and the global south in accessing and controlling resources. So why should we be relying on human rights? That's because human rights incorporate widely agreed upon values and principles such as equity, dignity, solidarity, and justice. Because they challenge the logic of the failed neoliberal policies which have ruled the policy and developmental arena for more than 4 decades. Because human rights contain legally binding obligations, it means that necessities for human well-being, such as water, food, healthcare, housing, education, are non-negotiables. Because human rights require governments to generate sufficient resources to ensure the realization of rights both individually and collectively. That includes taking steps to ensure the realization of rights of those beyond their own borders. Because human rights give greater normative weight to demands for fundamental and structural changes to global economic governance to tackle both income and wealth inequality and enable a fair distribution of resources to all so that every person can live a dignified life. At CSR, we argue that the primary purpose of a rights-based economy would be to guarantee the material, social, and environmental conditions necessary for all people to live with dignity on a flourishing planet. The measure of its success is whether all people are able to enjoy their full rights, economic and social, civil and political, cultural and environmental, without discrimination and without reducing the ability of future generations to do so. Human rights, we argue, enrich our vision of economic justice by providing a widely agreed framework of ethical values and legal obligations that should underpin our economies, informed by a holistic understanding of human well-being. They demand actions to redistribute resources, remedy inequalities, and rebalance power. The standards and principles of human rights law give force, flesh, and specificity to fundamental values such as dignity, equity, fairness, solidarity, accountability, and justice, which resonate strongly in current debates around alternative visions of the economy. A rights-based approach could transform critical areas of the economic policy, social protection, labor rights and wages, public services, tax, and corporate regulation. It would require a seismic shift in global economic governance to fundamentally transform what we produce, distribute, consume, and value in our economies, from exploiting, plundering natural resources to respecting planetary boundaries, from a fixation on economic growth to a more holistic, ecologically sound, and human-centered measures of success, from taking unpaid care work for granted to recognizing its place at the center of our societies, from valorizing the private sector to reclaiming the power of the public, from corporate monopolies to worker and community power, from elite capture to renewing democracy at local, national, and global level. I really look forward to the rest of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for sharing that great introduction to a rights-based economy with us, Maria. I guess it actually sets the foundation and the tone and the scene for the webinar today. We're really excited to the conversations that we'll be taking on. I think for me, even just the energy of how you've set in terms of the 5 key pillars that you've mentioned, all the way from, substantive equality to decolonizing and democratizing the economy. And those are some of the conversations we're going to have today with the interventions from our great speakers who we have on deck today. So, of course, there is a growing recognition that a new model of the economy system or social contract which centers on human rights is needed to be able to tackle the polycrisis that we face today. So historically, integrating human rights responsibilities within fiscal policy has been a rarity, and you have been able to mention some of those challenges. But the ongoing polycrisis has also made gender equality and empowerment of all women and girls elusive and to a certain extent unattainable, therefore creating a greater agency for collective action to be able to rethink and to co-create a just, inclusive, sustainable, and transformative social, political, and economic architecture that leaves no one behind. So today's conversation, we're going to be able, of course, to address it through a feminist approach to, of course, the rights-based approach to economy and financing, which is vital to the equitable, sustainable world for not only women and girls, but everyone in within the society. And we use this because feminist perspectives do challenge the status quo to rethink systems and unlock possibilities for transformative change that is inclusive and sustainable. So we will be, throughout the session, of course, using the foundations of a rights-based approach, acknowledging the multifaceted nature of a feminist future and analyzing the consequences of the interconnected challenges that women and girls face. We draw from a body of knowledge of feminist research, exploring the perceptions of women's perspectives on these matters, especially focusing on the underrepresented voices and feminist viewpoints. So I'm just going to go ahead and call out our first speaker to be able to kick off the conversation. And we do have Nelly. Nelly, are you with us? Nelly Shiguango. So Nelly, just as you're coming in, Nelly Shiguango is from the Federation of Indigenous Organizations of Napo, Ecuador. Nelly is a prominent educator and community leader with extensive experience in social control, citizen participation, and public management. Currently, she teaches Quechua at the IWRAW Scientific Station and has been a teacher at IWRA in 2023 and 2024. She was the coordinator of Project to Strengthen Community Tourism in Napo and has worked on transcription and translation in Quechua with linguist Connie Dickinson. She is currently one of the community coordinators of the project Indigenous Women Building Plurinational and Multicultural Democracy in Ecuador in the post-pandemic that is developed jointly with CDES. So Nelly, thank you so much for joining us. I just want to be able to start off this conversation with you so that you can be able to describe, in your opinion and in your experience, what alternative economic practices look like in Indigenous communities and what lessons can be learned from these practices to inform the broader economic models. Welcome, Nelly.
Ali punja tukui kaibitiau kuarmiguna kangonara makita kuyani. Buenos días a todos. Aquí digo buenos días porque estamos a las 6 de la mañana, levantándonos, preparándonos para salir a nuestros trabajos. Bueno, ustedes aquí en Ecuador saben la hora, cuánto estamos, y están haciendo trabajar desde tan muy temprano, así como nosotros las mujeres trabajamos desde muy temprano para tener nuestra economía, nuestra vida y nuestra suma causa. Buenos días.
So that our lives are also up and going as well. Good morning to you all.
de la economía como mujeres indígenas y desde el punto de vista como nos miran lo externo, que es la economía, es la economía de la pobreza y la economía de los ricos. Entonces, a nosotros nos consideran pobres a los pueblos indígenas. Yo no sé cuándo nos van a considerar que nosotros somos ricos, pero la vida de nosotros es eso, ¿no? Disfrutar de lo que nosotros tenemos a nuestro alrededor. Ya, pienso que la economía, para que los demás, los ricos, hagan la economía, quien lo trabaja somos los que ellos consideran pobres. ¿No? Le damos la vida, le damos la materia prima, le damos todo. Eso está en los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, yo siempre les digo por qué ellos, los ricos, nos consideran pobres a nosotros cuando tenemos toda la riqueza, toda la alimentación, la vestimenta, casi que no necesitaríamos del mundo capitalista, pero así lo hicieron, lo entiendo, así lo hicieron para explotar a nosotros, ellos consideran los que más poseen dinero. En ese sentido, nosotros, con el apoyo de CEDES Ecuador, pues estamos haciendo un trabajo conjunta con las mujeres lideresas de las comunidades. La FOIN tiene 150 comunidades de base. Son comunidades de base de primer grado, de segundo grado y la organización FOIN es de tercer grado. Entonces ahí soy dirigente, pues ahí estoy sirviendo también como coordinadora de este proyecto Construyendo la Democracia. Y ahí tengo 50 mujeres hablando del tema de economía. ¿Ya? Porque a nosotros nos tienen aquí en Ecuador con emprendimientos, y queremos entender, hemos dicho, queremos entender ese emprendimiento. Nos tienen algunas ONGs y algunos consejos de gobiernos autónomos, algunos ministerios de gobierno, que hablando de economía solamente invitando que nosotros elaboremos nuestros productos y llevemos a una exposición hasta ahí. Nos quieren hacer ver qué es el emprendimiento y tal vez eso sea la economía para ellos. Pero ahora, en cambio, en este espacio, construyendo la democracia, estamos entendiendo que eso no es la economía como tal. Entendemos, nosotros vivimos en economía comunitaria. Ya, si yo trabajo y yo estoy trabajando el cacao, yo trabajo el plátano, yo trabajo para mandar hacia afuera, hacia los capitalistas, para que ellos ganen más recursos, pues nosotros trabajamos, aunque poco, pero trabajamos compartidos. Está mi hermano, y está mi mamá, y están mis hijos, todos colaborativos. En Minga, y eso lo vendemos para que ese recurso regrese a nuestras casas. Ese recurso que sale, pues es para la salud, para la vestimenta, para todo lo que nosotros necesitamos para nuestros estudios de los hijos. Aunque les dije al inicio que nosotros tenemos todo. Si yo quiero consumir cacao, chocolate, tengo cacao. Si yo quiero consumir el café de calidad, tengo café. Si tengo alimentación, tengo todo. Pero nos hacen ver que la economía necesitamos el dinero para consumir lo que ellos producen. La ropa de calidad, las farmacias, haciendo ver que nuestros productos nos sirven, nuestros productos tradicionales nos sirven, haciendo ver de que todo lo que ellos producen es dinero. Eso es lo que nosotros necesitamos para vivir, cuando no es así. Entonces, eso es lo que nosotros ahora estamos formando a mujeres que defienden el derecho de la economía, del suma causa. Ya, no todo lo que nos dicen afuera, lo que dicen la economía es, ellos es explotando a nosotros, explotando a los pueblos indígenas. Pero cuando nosotros hacemos la economía compartiendo, hablando de la solidaridad, y todos como que queremos vivir en comunidad, lo que hacemos, lo que acumulamos, pocos recursos que tenemos, siempre estamos compartiendo en familia, apoyando a nuestros padres. Entonces, eso es la economía para nosotros. Eso estamos, más que todo, no entendiendo, sino haciendo análisis, haciendo ver al otro mundo de que la economía, nuestra forma de entender, nuestra forma de vivir es eso. No porque tengo una choza, soy pobre. Porque no tengo, porque cocino en una candela a fuego, es pobre. No porque utilizo la medicina tradicional, soy pobre. No porque tengo la madera de esta, soy pobre. Sino es nuestra riqueza, nuestra forma de vida y nuestra economía. Y eso es la vida. Si a mí me encierran en una casa de cemento, ahí me siento pobre. Ahí voy a morirme porque me da todo tipo de enfermedad. Porque la casa no es mía, la casa es fría. No es mi modo de vida, sino que me vendieron por los ojos que eso es vivir en riqueza. Pero cuando yo vivo en una casa de estas, para mí es el buen vivir, disfrutando la vida y el mundo de los recursos que nosotros tenemos a nuestro alrededor. No sé si con eso me hago entender, estoy alargándome mucho y muchísimas gracias.
Am I making myself understood or am I taking too long? Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for sharing your interventions, Nelly. It's really great to see how the solidarity in Africa, we call it Ubuntu, in terms of how women from indigenous communities are coming together to actually be able to provide for the rights-based services, which is what a lot of people, especially in developing countries, are trying to call out their governments to be able to provide for. It's really good also in terms of also the understanding and how you've shared in terms of power dynamics and how the economy is built for the rich versus the poor. But it's very crucial in terms of how, of course, a rights-based approach, which does not necessarily see them, which would be able to actually be able to provide for everyone and not be able to tackle the intersectionality dynamics of class, race, gender, etc., and put everyone in one strategic pool to be able to benefit from the resources of the government. So thank you so much for your intervention, Nelly. I'm going to call next our next speaker, who's Eva. Eva, are you there with us? And as Eva is coming on, I'll just go ahead and share about Eva. So Eva Martínez-Acosta is an Ecuadorian lawyer with postgraduate studies in human rights, international relations, and she actually works as the Economic Justice Program in CDES and is the general coordinator of the project Indigenous Women, Building Plurinational and Multicultural Democracy in Ecuador as well in the post-pandemic, that is developed jointly with what Nelly initially shared as well. So Eva, thank you so much for also joining us today from CDES. And Eva, I would call you to be able to share with us your experiences in working with the community that practice alternative economic models, and what key insights and lessons have you learned from these communities? Of course, complementary to what Nelly have already shared within your personal perspective as well, within your space of work.
Hola, Eva. Buenos días con todas. Voy a aprovechar que hay interpretación para hablar en español, que es mi idioma natal, y así poder explicarles de mejor manera cómo nuestro trabajo. Bueno, primero agradecer a Nelly por aceptar la participación en este webinar y decir que a la vez para mí es como muy enriquecedor trabajar con las compañeras en las comunidades. Más bien yo aprendo de ellas todos los días. Ha sido un proceso, la verdad, muy enriquecedor. Y nada, para empezar, solo debo decir que las mujeres seguimos sufriendo de manera desproporcionada la pobreza, la discriminación y la explotación. La discriminación de género implica que a menudo las mujeres acabamos desempeñando trabajos no seguros, mal pagados, y seguimos siendo una pequeña minoría en puestos directivos, ¿no? Este tipo de condiciones empeoran aún más para las mujeres que viven en áreas rurales, generalmente en Ecuador, mujeres indígenas, y reducen el acceso a bienes económicos como la tierra, los préstamos, y limita su participación en el diseño de políticas sociales y económicas. Otro aspecto que también debemos considerar es que siempre las tareas domésticas recaen en las mujeres, por lo que suelen tener poco tiempo libre para aprovechar oportunidades económicas. Acá, con el Centro de Derechos Económicos y Sociales CEDES, trabajamos en el proyecto Mujeres de las Nacionalidades Amazónicas, fortaleciendo sus espacios de formación territorial para construir la democracia plurinacional e intercultural en el Ecuador de la pospandemia. Este proyecto lo realizamos con mujeres de la Amazonía ecuatoriana que ya vienen de un primer proceso. El CEDES lideró este primer proceso de formación y partimos de una base de experiencia que ha sostenido 3 escuelas de mujeres amazónicas. Hicimos 2 publicaciones para la formación y la incidencia política y alrededor de 400 asistencias de capacitaciones y decenas de talleres, ¿no? Que han logrado una presencia del movimiento feminista indígena en el interior de los pueblos y nacionalidades de la Amazonía ecuatoriana. También debemos tomar en cuenta que llevar un proceso en la región amazónica es difícil por la dispersión de las personas que viven en zonas rurales o terrenos de la selva, y esto dificulta de alguna manera la movilización, la logística, y en general se soporta gracias a las redes de cooperación comunitaria, debido a la ausencia del Estado, y sus servicios son característicos en esta zona. En base a esta experiencia, logramos configurar una pedagogía del territorio que trata de cómo el ser y estar en el territorio nos forma como parte de ella. Pone en debate además las construcciones culturales sexogenéricas que se han ido configurando en el territorio en base al enfoque de derechos. Por tanto, estos espacios de formación se proyectan para estudiar el uso y el manejo del territorio desde las cosmovisiones de las nacionalidades para sostener la vida o el summa causal, como nosotros le llamamos acá en el Ecuador y sobre todo en las comunidades indígenas. Y desde ahí construir una democracia plural, inclusiva, en el marco de los principios de plurinacionalidad e intercultural. En estas condiciones tenemos una base más o menos de 80 a 100 mujeres que están en el proceso de manera más sostenida, es decir, son beneficiarias y que tienen un perfil de cuadro político, ¿no? Pero hay una población flotante de mujeres interesadas en estos procesos de formación que empiezan a constituir bases de un movimiento que impulsa la equidad de género con enfoque plurinacional. Nuestro objetivo en los próximos años es que las mujeres ocupen tanto puestos de liderazgo, al igual que los hombres indígenas. En este año, en este segundo proceso de capacitación que tenemos con las mujeres, estamos teniendo un mayor énfasis en la incidencia política. Creemos que no hay mejor aprendizaje político que la propia exigibilidad de derechos hecha práctica. Así también nos estamos introduciendo en el empoderamiento económico, que implica sobre todo prácticas de economía comunitaria y en general políticas de incidencia pública que mejoren las condiciones materiales de vida de las comunidades que fueron fuertemente afectadas por la pandemia y por la austeridad fiscal adoptada en el Ecuador desde el año 2018. Actualmente tenemos 3 escuelas en este proyecto que están distribuidas en la región centro, norte y sur de la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Tenemos al norte la Red de Mujeres por la Vida, que pertenece a la Unión de Afectados por la petrolera Texaco, que involucra a 80 comunidades de 6 nacionalidades. En la región norte, que corresponde a las provincias de Orellana y Sucumbíos, se encuentra la menor densidad poblacional. Ahí trabajamos con las comunidades Siecopay, Siona, Aicofán, Y además las nacionalidades más numerosas, quichua, shuar y guarani. En la segunda nacionalidad, la nacionalidad quichua amazónica, está en la región centro de la Amazonía, que es donde viene Nelly. Ahí trabajamos con la Escuela de la Federación de Organizaciones Indígenas del Napo FOIN. Y al sur está el asentamiento más poblado de la nacionalidad shuar. Ahí trabajamos con la Federación de Nacionalidades Shuar de Pastaza, la FENASH. Nosotras empezamos este trabajo realizando un diagnóstico con las comunidades de las 3 escuelas, haciendo una diferenciación, ¿no?, entre economía capitalista y economía comunitaria. Esto lo realizamos en base a un diagnóstico. Entonces aquí se diferencia, ¿no?, la economía capitalista, que tiene como características del trabajo en beneficio individual, acumulación individualizada, propiedad individual, explotación de la naturaleza, relaciones jerárquicas de poder, trabajo por un salario o dinero y sujeción siempre a un jefe. Por otro lado, hicieron una diferenciación con la economía comunitaria, que ellas lo ven como un trabajo en beneficio colectivo, distribución colectiva, propiedad colectiva, respeto y armonía con la naturaleza, sobre todo, relaciones horizontales, trabajo con un objetivo, lo que aquí se denominan las mingas, y sujeción a la voluntad asambleitaria. Todas estas ideas configuran una concepción de la economía diferente, alternativa a la dominante, el bienestar entre miembros de la misma organización, el respeto a la naturaleza y el bien común son pilares de la economía comunitaria. Acá también hacemos referencia a una economía que piensa en comunidad al sembrar la chacra, que es el espacio donde ellas siembran, para el autoconsumo familiar, intercambio, venta de los productos y mediante ello la obtención de recursos económicos para el sostenimiento de la salud, educación, necesidad de servicios básicos y por último para compartir el entorno a la naturaleza. Acá es muy importante resaltar lo que dijo Nelly, ¿no? Que la economía comunitaria va más allá de los emprendimientos, que muchas veces los emprendimientos son solo para sobrevivencia, para el día a día. Nosotros queremos buscar algo que vaya más allá, que algo que no solo sea de sobrevivencia, sino que de verdad sea una forma de vida. Ya que el territorio es la fuente del sustento, de la vida espiritual y cultural, y una de las principales fuentes de sustento económico. Bueno, para ir ya terminando, en base al tiempo, nosotros queremos poner énfasis en el empoderamiento económico de las mujeres, porque esto contribuye a la igualdad de género, la erradicación de la pobreza y un crecimiento económico inclusivo. Las mujeres contribuyen de manera muy significativa a las economías. La economía comunitaria, por lo tanto, se trata de un sistema de economía propio de las nacionalidades amazónicas del Ecuador, de propiedad colectiva, que tiene como base material de vida el territorio, en el que se desarrollan relaciones horizontales de trabajo para alcanzar un objetivo común, establecido mediante la voluntad asambleitaria y de carácter redistributivo. Su relación con la naturaleza tiene como principio consuetudinario el respeto y la armonía con la naturaleza. También la economía, es importante decir que la economía comunitaria está ligada a la conservación del territorio, la materia prima que es empleada para elaboración de artesanías, turismo comunitario y el abastecimiento alimentario, que dependen de su relación con el territorio. Ya para cerrar, bueno, agradecerles por la invitación que nos hicieron tanto a mí como a Nelly. Y aquí se trata también del proyecto que tenemos con CEDES. Siempre se trata de un aprendizaje mutuo. Yo aprendo cada día de las mujeres amazónicas y la verdad que esto ha sido, es un proceso y un camino de verdad enriquecedor. Y acá termino. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Eva. It's really, really enlightening to actually hear more about community-based economies as an alternative. I have so many questions, but of course we'll save that for the question and answer session in terms of actually taking that initiative to be able to provide for yourselves in terms of access to healthcare, access to education, food security, etc. But also trying to see, would like to know more about, of course, the government's interventions or maybe uptake in terms of trying to implement that within their government policies, or whether it's just now every woman for herself kind of situation. Thank you so much for sharing that. Please keep writing your comments and sharing your feedback on the interventions we've had so far. If you do have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and then we can be able to take those on as we go into our question and answer session. Now, we've had an overview, of course, about our rights-based issues. We've started sharing on alternatives and what alternatives could look like in terms of course, feminist futures, what's currently also happening on ground, what could happen, and of course, the overview of trying to use a rights-based approach. Now, of course, according to human rights law, the government, it's the responsibility of the states to be able to ensure that all individuals under their jurisdiction have access to fundamental human rights, including healthcare, education, food, clean drinking water, and suitable housing. Therefore, governments must technically be mustn't be hindered in guaranteeing the fulfillment of fundamental human rights due to whether overwhelming, for example, debt obligations or any other reason which would be against human rights law. And then, of course, we have the Convention for Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, which doesn't, of course, normally explicitly mention other economic factors. However, as seen as Article 2 of the Convention, it requires country members to undertake all necessary steps to end discrimination against women in all its form and to be able to pursue all appropriate means and without delay a policy of eliminating discrimination against women. So I'm going to call on our next speaker. And as Connie is coming in, I'll just briefly introduce her. Constanza Pauchulo coordinates the Euro-Asia Pacific Program on Feminist Approaches to Economics and Development. And this supports its program on countering human rights regression and UN capture. She has a master's in international law from the London School of Economics and Political Science and a master's in social and political thought from York University. Constanza is actually born in Argentina, grew up in Canada, and currently lives in Malaysia. So Connie, I just briefly mentioned about, of course, CEDAW and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in line with international human rights law. So within CEDAW framework, what are your thoughts around, of course, the rights-based economy framework and how can it support the development of alternative economic practices in local communities? And in your opinion, what are some of the concrete examples of this integration in action? How can we leverage on CEDAW as a tool of accountability when it comes to a rights-based economy, especially within the dynamics of the human rights of women?
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you, Nelly and Eva. I've been madly typing away, kind of rethinking my whole presentation as you all were sharing about your work and your relationship with the economy and what it means. So bear with me. Hopefully some of the things I say still kind of flow and respond to Nicole's question. But basically, what I wanted to start with is the fact that a lot of people have described CEDAW as the linchpin of the broader human rights framework because it has a very high ratification rate. Only 4 countries in the world have not signed on, and therefore has broad implications for aligning all government activities with gender equality, women's human rights, and international human rights frameworks more broadly. So I think that's one of the reasons why we're using it as an example for this session. But for those of you in the room who may not have used the convention or its processes that much, maybe new to it, I thought I'd start with a little bit of what is CEDAW before jumping into the questions on a rights-based economy. So very briefly, it's considered the International Bill of Rights for Women and was adopted in 1979. It covers specific areas like education, health, labor, the rights of rural women, and has new guidance around climate justice, the rights of Indigenous women and girls, and other areas that aren't explicitly set out in the text of the convention. It also has as its core framework the requirement that state parties eliminate all forms of gender discrimination, both in law and in the lived realities of different groups of women, and puts measures in place to advance substantive equality. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means later on. Very importantly, the convention includes trans women and intersex people and requires an intersectional approach to discrimination and the measures put in place to end it that address the lived realities of historically and structurally marginalized groups of women and the multiple forms of discrimination they face. So put a little bit more simply, an intersectional approach is confirmed and adopted by the CEDAW committee and how the convention should be applied. It's a living document. And it's always helpful for me to remember and motivating for me to remember that it's not just a piece of paper. It was born of a global feminist women's rights movement, pushed in particular by the work of Global South Feminist. It belongs to movements, it belongs to communities, and it belongs to those bearing the greatest burden of current unjust global economic systems. And this is seen most strongly for me if you look at the CEDAW preamble, which are the introductory paragraphs at the beginning of the convention. And there you see a call for a new international economic order. You see an emphasis around the need to eradicate apartheid, racism, colonialism, and the interference in the internal politics of states. So we see states at the beginning of this agreeing to, when they're signing on to the convention, and of course the movements and communities that push for this language, are agreeing to a politics of decolonization and a politics of anti-imperialism that's embedded into the history of the convention and really requires our involvement to bring it to life and make it real. So one of our roles at IWRAW-AP, along with others in the women's rights movement, is to help strengthen the links between these international processes and instruments and the movements and communities who are living, creating, and demanding economic alternatives. It's not a complete answer to everything, but its aspirational potential depends on Southern feminists and social movements claiming it and infusing its standards and its mechanisms with the politics and lived experiences necessary to transform our economies. So as I was listening to Nelly and Eva and Nicole as well, your thoughts in between, I was thinking, how do we use CEDAW to prioritize economies of buen vivir, as Nelly mentioned, or Ubuntu, as Nicole mentioned, or of care, of solidarity? Because ultimately, these human rights frameworks are not separate from politics and ideologies, and they can either serve as a way to soften exploitative practices, so not really lead to the transformation or the rethinking, reframing that we're talking about, or they can be a tool that supports movements and communities in transforming how we think about the economy and how we relate to each other and the environment through this notion of the economy. So that's something I don't really have an answer to. It can be challenging, and sometimes you do get stuck in these very formalistic or state-centric ways of going through the process, but there is a lot of potential there, and there's a lot of life to the convention itself and its processes that live outside of what you see maybe in the formal meetings that happen at the UN and things like that. So my idea, and Nicole, please jump in if I'm going too long or once I'm starting to run out of time. But my idea was to not go into the details of the convention, but instead talk about 3 concrete ways that we might think of CEDAW within our work. And the first is CEDAW as an accountability tool. So there are formal country review processes. Your countries have agreed to be bound by the treaty and fulfill its obligation. Part of this includes reporting to the CEDAW committee, which is made up of 23 independent experts from different regions around the world. And they have to tell the committee what progress they're making to eliminate gender discrimination and advance substantive equality. Civil society is vital to this process. They provide alternative information, they correct inaccurate or misleading information given by the state, or they fill gaps, maybe where there has been no information provided at all about a particular group of women or a particular situation and how it impacts women's human rights. So through the participating in this country review process, we can influence the questions the committee asks of our government and the recommendations they make for meeting their human rights obligation. And we can take these dialogues and recommendations, all of which are available publicly, back to our national level advocacy to push for the policies or institutional transformations needed to advance alternative rights-based economic models. And we have a few more concrete examples around what that might look like in a shadow report guideline on gender equality and macroeconomics, which I will drop into the chat shortly. And you can take a look at some examples of how NGOs have dealt with the issue or civil society and how the committee have dealt with the issue. The second way of thinking about how CEDAW might fit into your work or into this area of work is to view CEDAW also as a mobilizing space. So you can do a lot of coalition building around this review process, which right now it's in the process of being changed, but for now I can say it happens on a 4-year cycle. So you see within the women's rights movement that you often have a large group of or a group of different organizations in one country or even in other countries who are impacted by the country being reviewed, all coming together to submit information as a coalition or support the advocacy of different groups around this one event. You know, our country, our governments are being called up by the committee to talk about how they're meeting their obligations, and it provides this opportunity for mobilizing within the women's rights movement and also across different movements. This doesn't mean that everyone agrees, of course, but it offers a space for different fault lines within the movement and forms of solidarity to unfold and hopefully build a stronger collectivity around rights-based economies and the alternative economic models we've been hearing about. There's also, around this mobilizing space, there's opportunities for raising awareness among the general public through press conferences or media pieces organized around the public sessions, social media campaigns that can follow and publish what government officials are saying or committing to in real time when they're at the UN meeting with the committee. So again, it's kind of thinking of this as more than just the formal review process and as one of the tools for mobilizing and building connections across and within movements. The third and final way that we can use the convention and its processes in our work around rights-based economies is as a narrative building tool, which is based on universal norms and standards. And we heard a bit about this when Maria had her very helpful introduction. And we know that human rights hold narrative power based on universal norms, standards, and shared values around dignity, equality, justice, participatory democracy, and solidarity. So the CEDAW principles in particular of non-discrimination and substantive equality add to that narrative value or power by saying, for example, under non-discrimination, that it's not enough to have something that looks good on paper, i.e. in laws and policies. What matters is the outcome and effect on women's everyday lives. So if a government is relying on a neoliberal narrative that privatization of public services is the most efficient and therefore the best economic policy, we can question A, the idea of efficiency, and B, what the impact and outcome of these policies are on different groups of women. And we know there's so much data and experience out there already that there's a disproportionately negative and discriminatory effect on women, therefore violating CEDAW and requiring the state to adopt different kinds of measures. So that framework of and requirement of non-discrimination can be a way of reframing or creating a different kind of narrative around who the economy should be serving and what this and who the states are actually beholden to. It's not the corporations or the powerful, it's the rights holders. Similarly, substantive equality, the other CEDAW principle, is different than formal equality, which sees men and women as the same and then sets conditions based on a male standard. Substantive equality instead recognizes that there are differences and places the obligation on the state to correct the environment that disadvantages women. So this necessarily means correcting the economic environment at global and national scales. And I think that's a really important entry point for where we can be a bit more creative in using the obligations in this convention to push for a correction of the environment so that it supports Buen Vivir or it supports Ubuntu or a care-centered approach. Those kinds of principles are where that potential lies, I think, or one of the places. And importantly, my last piece will just be that while the convention is talking specifically about equality of women and all their diversity, we know that women, particularly racialized women and women facing multiple forms of discrimination, bear the greatest brunt of an unjust economic system, being disproportionately represented in data around poverty, though we've learned today about questioning what poverty means and how we think about that, lack of resources, unpaid or underpaid labor, and so on. So correcting the environment for women means correcting the environment for similarly marginalized and excluded groups, and the CEDAW framework can provide important normative and narrative hooks for advancing alternative rights-based economies and bringing in different groups of people and movements along the way. I think that's it for me.
Thank you so much for that great overview, Connie. I think also it's very important to be able to know what sort of legal tools that we can be able to use for accountability, especially it comes to the human rights of women, both at the regional level, but also importantly at the global level. It's great that you mentioned that IWRAW Asia Pacific has the shadow report guideline on gender and microeconomics, and that you'll be able to share with that. We've really also been hearing a lot about, of course, feminist macroeconomics analysis and how that has also contributed to sort of rethinking what feminist futures could look like. But most importantly, feminist macroeconomic analysis has, built on and it's complemented other progressive alternative economic or development models, such as degrowth, a care economy, solidarity economies, and it seeks to challenge, the dominant economic models which have been rooted in the failed neoliberal paradigms that we've been able to share today. In terms of course, the capitalist current financial architecture, but it's mostly been aligned with a lot of the, feminist demands that we see today, including what you've shared on CEDAW. So it actually brings me to our next speaker, Jessica. Jessica, I hope you're still with us. And as Jessica is coming in, I'll just go ahead and introduce her. So Jessica Mandanda is an advocacy communications specialist with core expertise in economic justice and rights, holding over 6 years experience in development, communications, campaigning, and policy analysis for the gendered impact of macroeconomic policy level environment in Africa. Her experience includes analyzing and presenting the gendered impact of austerity measures on public service delivery and campaigning for an economy that works for women. She's a member of the Feminist Macroeconomics Alliance, Malawi, where she provides strategic advisory on communications and campaigning for economic justice and rights. Welcome, Jessica. So Jessica, we're now getting into the conversation into, of course, feminist macroeconomic analysis. Connie has shared with us in terms of course, country reports, the CEDAW processes, and I know Malawi just recently came from its CEDAW sessions, and she's urged us to be able to, have a lot of narrative building around the CEDAW processes, but also to be able to hold our governments accountable, especially when it comes to women's economic justice and rights, and some of what they share during their country dialogues. So Jessica, how does feminist macroeconomics inform the analysis of public service delivery and financing? And in your opinion, in the recent shadow report submitted for Malawi CEDAW review, what are your thoughts about the report and what key recommendations emerged from this analysis? Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Nicole. Please do let me know if I cut off at some point because of the internet connection here. So to answer your question, how does feminist macroeconomics inform the analysis of public service delivery? First and foremost, it's by centering care, well-being, intersectionality, and humanity at its core. So I think from all the speakers and from everything that we've learned so far, and in the conversations that we have had around the state of public service delivery, especially in the Global South, one thing that has become very clear is that public services go hand in hand with this assumed patriarchal relegation of all care work, all well-being and nurture to women, and specifically women as defined by the Black and white binary, right? And in the history of the neoliberal agenda, there's also those linkages to colonialism, but overall also the patriarchy that speak to the same. So in that, when public services fail, women are automatically expected to carry out work to close the gap that is created. And I love how the first speaker also already alluded to this, to say that women are generally just used to getting up very early to work and carry the economy, right? And so through this patriarchal set of norms, the work that women have done over the years to carry the economy, to close out that gap that is created, is also not accounted for. Now, when we look at the neoliberal economic framework, what we know is that one of its core tenets is the requirement for the state to reallocate its responsibility of care to the people. It does this slowly over several periods and rounds of austerity, removing funds to the public services, prioritizing the private sector, and implementing policies such as the structural adjustment programs and the public sector wage bill caps, which is the case for Malawi. So for Malawi, this has also included placing a cap on how many people can be hired or enrolled into the public sector, and therefore creating this wide gap on the end of employment, but also on the end of service delivery, because then we don't have enough people to provide public services. And in regards to the budget cuts, this has also meant having very limited resources to maintain and provide essential services, including healthcare and education, limited resources to maintain critical equipment, as well as purchase new up-to-date equipment and medication, specifically for the healthcare system, which became even more apparent in Malawi during COVID-19, where for the entirety of the country, we had less than 10 ICU beds available. We barely had medication. We did not have enough frontline medical practitioners, let alone access to vaccines and human resources, just as an example. So this is not—
Sorry, Jessica, just a request to slow down a bit.
Okay. Sorry. All right. So the example of Malawi specifically with the healthcare system and how the neoliberal economic framework has crippled our ability to provide and maintain public services became very apparent during COVID-19, where we could not manage to care for the sick. We could not manage by ourselves to recover the country's health and the country's well-being. And so that responsibility fell on the back of women primarily, because now it is women who had to find indigenous interventions for healthcare, because healthcare was either inaccessible or it simply just wasn't available, right? Now, again, going back to how the lack of provision of public services, or rather, one of the things that has happened with the neoliberal agenda is to relegate that responsibility to women, is because of those patriarchal norms. So they go hand in hand. Now, this also applies to what has happened with the public education system, where over the years, as we continue to implement several rounds of austerity measures, the public education system, the quality of education, and the available teachers and the available infrastructure has reduced. And again, that is because we have continuously relegated the responsibility of providing for that to either women or to the private sector. So for feminist macroeconomics, this is where we would start, right? To outline how the current economic framework in Malawi has not worked. It has gradually diminished the state's ability to care for the people by making it nearly impossible for the state to provide and maintain public services, let alone begin the conversation to ensure that public services are gender responsive. And now linking to the second question, this is why and where, as an alliance, we saw it as an opportunity to respond to that. So maybe a bit of background, the Feminist Macroeconomic Alliance here in Malawi was formed directly in response to the gap in economic justice, essentially because there was no feminist analysis being done on the impact of the current economic model, especially the gendered impact. So we started from there, right? We started by understanding what are the provisions around the economy in Malawi and what the responsibilities of the state are in regards to the economy for women specifically. So Malawi, similar to a lot of other countries, is ratified to a multitude of human rights conventions and is legally obligated to domesticate and implement the provisions of the conventions. This includes CEDAW, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and subsequently that the rights to health, rights to education, rights to life, as well as the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, just to name a few. All of which have been domesticated into our constitution. So as per the Constitution of Malawi, the government is responsible for providing for the rights to health, rights to education, and rights to life, as well as rights to dignity. And it explicitly talks about how it is the responsibility of the state to ensure that education, health are provided for, and that they should be affordable, accessible, and available at all times. So it is also the responsibility of the state to ensure that these public services are properly funded, properly maintained, and have an adequate number of people working within these public services to ensure that they're delivered properly. However, because Malawi follows the neoliberal agenda that has continuously defunded these specific public services, we have not been able to meet those obligations. So right now we have public services that are not accessible, they're not available, they're extremely poor in its quality. And because of austerity, as a country, we prioritize the private sector, which is inaccessible, unavailable, unaffordable for the vast majority of people. So we have this wide gap that has been created where you have private services on this end and poor public services on the other end. And you have the vast majority of Malawian people in the middle waiting for somebody to close that gap. And because of those patriarchal norms, we have women coming in. So our report wanted to address that. So we set out on this journey of gathering information and gathering experiences around how people have been able to access or have been able to close that gap individually and share that. Now, one thing that was also very interesting last year is that as we shared our report and as we followed the review of Malawi with the CEDAW committee, some of the things that we had shared in our report were confirmed by the Malawi delegation that went to Geneva. So, for example, the state of public health was confirmed by the representatives from the Ministry of Health here to say that indeed our public health system is quite crippled in the way that it is trying to accommodate the population of Malawi. But also interestingly and specifically, we had a representative from the Ministry of Education who explicitly said, because of the current economic model and because of several agreements that we have with the international financial institutions such as the IMF, we cannot provide for the challenges and the gaps that are within the public sector because we already agreed. And again, going back to the neoliberal agenda where because of the several rounds of austerity and because of the specific policies that we implement as a country, we simply cannot take care of the people, right? And it's put us in a position where now, as much as we're trying as the feminist collectives here in Malawi, as well as civil society, it's still quite difficult. But we're coming back in to provide alternatives that respond to these specific challenges. So again, going back to how feminist macroeconomics informs this analysis is centering our alternatives on human rights, on well-being, on care, on intersectionality and the people. So again, asking how exactly are people experiencing public services and what can be done in order to address those services. And again, coming in from a point where we are critiquing the macro level policy decisions, but also offering or extending a hand of collaboration to say that, yes, this is as a result of years and years of austerity and years of very harmful economic policies being implemented. However, we need to start from a point of collaborating to say that as civil society, we've done the analysis, we have the information, we have the lived experiences, we have the data, and we also have practical ways in which these alternatives can start being implemented. We just need the state to take that hand and then we can move forward. So yes, I'll stop there for now and hand back over to you, Nicole. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us, Jessica. I think it's how you've been able to link feminist macroeconomic analysis, but most importantly also linking it to what is the current crisis, especially in relation to debt and austerity, and especially coming from Malawi's shadow report. Especially how we see a lot of, creditor-driven policy approaches to the debt crisis tend to neglect and take into account human rights, despite the negative impact that high external debt loads can have on them. So it's indeed crucial to acknowledge the current state of debt, especially in emerging economies. It's a very complex issue which has various aspects, and we've seen all the way from historical, environmental, political and economic components. And I think it goes to say how when it comes to financial and practical solutions, it cannot only be looked at, it would be considered insufficient. And so a human rights approach gives a clear, consistent and internationally acknowledged structure that can guide the creation and execution of, restructuring systems that can offer a fair and equitable and gender inclusive, sustainable future. So thank you so much for that, Jessica. We'll just call on our last intervention. We have Amna. Amna, are you there with us? Great. So Amna Terrass is a Chief Communications Officer and Analyst at OTE. She brings back 10 years of human rights defense and feminist activism. She previously worked as a strategic consultant and empirical researcher with many groups and partners in Morocco and the region. Before shifting to associative work, she enrolled in a master's in biotechnology and sustainable development and now focuses on understanding the imbrication between climate and environmental rights, assets, access, and food production by and for women. So thank you so much for joining us, Anna. And I would just like to ask you on, of course, you work in research. What is the importance, of course, of gender desegregated data in economic policy making, and how does that incorporate into what Maria shared earlier in terms of democratization and decolonization agenda? How can we complete a decolonization agenda to influence the reimagining of our financial architecture for a more equitable future? Amna, over to you. Sorry, we can't hear you, Amna.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Yes,
Okay,
go ahead.
so it's just a question of parameters. So thank you, Nicole, Maria, and the interpreters. I also thank the CESR for convening this webinar. My sisters Eva, Jessica, Constanza. I learned so much from your insightful interventions about how women are organizing to resist hostile classes and racist and patriarchal conjuncture by creating their own alternatives or by engaging in advocacy at different levels. I will start my talk by explicitly reminding myself and ourselves that if we are today talking about disaggregated data and how data can be useful, it is because we are all aware that the actual global financial system is patriarchal and classist by nature, and he is more probably generating hostile economic dynamics, and we need disaggregated data to control this hostility and to mitigate it. But we are aware that this should not be the final objective. Okay, let's talk about some data and examples of how are they actually used and how can their use be improved to help inform policymakers to make informed decisions and also movements to push forward the human rights-based economy. Let's start by development policies. In terms of development policies, there are many disaggregated data that are already collected on individuals, including employment, education, but we have many data that are only collected at household levels, like asset access, asset control, ownership, etc. And this is very important because these kind of data inform us about the class of women, and the availability of data is conditioned by the state's ideology, but also history, colonial history, and it determines in each turn how policies are framed and thinked. You know, I work in a Tunisian watchdog, but I bring with me some knowledge about Morocco also, not only because I'm Moroccan, but also because in theory we include the regional integration as one of the scopes of our agenda. So let me start talking about something that is familial. In Morocco, for example, policies of collective land redistribution are only made at all generation household level. And this was one of the main reasons why a project to title 51,000 hectares of collective land in the Gharb region of Morocco has failed in reporting differentiated impacts of privatization of land, women, and young people, and even generated many conflicts within the communities and between the community and the central government, and made it very difficult for young women and men to maintain social ties to their lands and impacted their labor decisions, etc., etc. So gender disaggregated data at individual level are very needed in order to design transformative policies that contribute to not only to the long-term redistribution of wealth, but also policies that engage in the mid-term transformation of the economic situation of people, especially women, children, migrants, and the other minorized and impoverished groups who have no access to wealth, to land, or a limited access to other resources. I talked about development and sustainable development policies. Let me talk also about health. And I will take the example of COVID-19 pandemic. Surveillance 6 disaggregated data were of big interest, for example, to monitor and identify gender responsive and evidence-informed solutions to address the key drivers of the pandemic and to examine trends on testing to outcome pathways, but also in order to inform the crisis social protection policies. According to a study's results that are drawn from 18 months global data collection from over 200 countries, the availability of data was very linked to economic status of the country. And when we say economic status of the country, we talk also about the history of colonization and all the factors that maintained some countries in not some countries, but a lot of countries in a situation of low income condition. Gender disaggregated data are also needed to assess the potential impacts of social security new systems. We talk about cash transfers, for example, especially on women in rural areas and underbanked people. We can also talk about education sector and what sex disaggregated data tell us about how both distance of schools from homes and whether sanitation are available or not in schools are serious factors of female dropouts from schools. In addition to social sectors related policies, these disaggregated gender data, when available, they are used to design composite indexes that encapsulate policy-relevant feminist knowledge on women experiences and their disadvantaged social, economic, and political position. This knowledge constitutes a conceptual framework that informs the selection of a number of dimensions that can be expressed through some indicators. And of course, the measurement is constrained by data availability, and the data availability is very structural and systemic in this regard. The gender composite indexes are very important and can be used by movements and organizations to strengthen the case to face the impoverishment of women and people of colors due to financial economic policies, especially those that target public services. It offers comparable information for a large number of countries and help monitor progress toward gender equality. But even those gender composite indexes have many limitations, and here my talk will be based on UN Women discussion paper towards improved measures of gender inequality. So according to UN Women, country rankings can be contested because it's disregard the colonial history that limits the capacity of the countries of the global south to fulfill their obligations on gender equality. And it reinforces the notion that each country is functioning on its own to address gender inequality. While there are many transborder factors that have differentiated impacts on women's situation according to their class, religion, and colors, so these indexes do not capture diversity by class or race or intersectionality or the size of gaps between the groups within the same country or the same region. And they provide a limited representation of gender equality by shrinking the concept through choices of dimensions, including reproductive labor. So according to a critical review, gender equality indices, all 17 existed multidimensional gender equality indices neglects unpaid reproductive labor. And the non-recognition of unpaid labor in general, in patriarchal orthodox economy, is a poignant issue, notably in Tunisia, for example, where women spend at least 5 hours per day on housework compared with just 39 minutes for men. And Jessica brilliantly showed how unpaid labor of women is very crucial in maintaining the work of organization, the work organization in the labor markets of the capital system. And I don't know if I have the time. I wanted to highlight.
Sorry, Amna. You have 1 minute left.
Okay. I just wanted to highlight some deficiencies in some UNDP gender indexes, but in general, it is about the fact that we use outdated indicators and useless indicators to talk about life expectancy, to talk about the life and long life and healthy life, and also the education. We don't take into account what women gain in terms of knowledge capital in schools, and also some methodological problems in using aggregated and disaggregated data in the same indexes, the problem of the irrelevance of some indicators in defining political participation of women. For example, in authoritarian regimes or facade democracies, we cannot talk about the share in national parliaments as a real indicator that reflects the women participation in making economic policies. I just wanted to say also that UN Women proposed 2 new gender indexes, and I think it is very important to consider this. Gender parity index, which is a relative measure of well-being, which encompasses the dimensions of health, education, decent standard of living and decision-making, and the Women's Empowerment Index that focuses on women and measures freedom from early motherhood, reproductive choice, freedom from anti-partner violence, as well as women's capability to seek education, pursue science, technology, engineering, etc. So we need to combine our efforts with those of the feminist and women organizations in order to call for gender-sensitive informational policy. We live in a world where the information and the data is more and more generated in order to maintain control, while we have disaggregated data scarcity in our countries, and that would be that would help us to assess the responsibility of the IFIs in the systemic violations of women, and to incorporate the feminist and human rights obligations into some issues like debt management and debt policies, etc., etc. We need to replace these violations in their context of patriarchal, capitalist, and colonial and racial domination, and the way how we use data and how we collect them are very important to inform these processes. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that intervention, Amna. I think it's very crucial how you highlight, of course, there's still a bit of a dearth of data, especially gender distributed data, to be able to advise policy, especially in relation to women's economic justice and rights, and some of the different thematic areas which you've just mentioned. It's very interesting for you to also mention in terms of course, the gender index or gender parity index that you've just mentioned. The load of course, or rather the unregistration or undocumentation or unrecognition of unpaid care work towards, of course, GDP and the economy. So thank you so much for all your interventions to the speakers. I'll just quickly take the questions which have come in. They're not, they're quite a handful. And so I'll just read out the 4 questions, and any of the speakers could come in and just give their comments and responses to the question. So the first question is from Hazel, and she wanted to know, does the ongoing process on the UN Tax Convention offer some opportunities to lobby and advocate for taxation for women's rights? How can we put these negotiations on the agenda of those working on rights-based economies? If there are any organizations working specifically on women's rights who are working within, of course, the convention about the UN Tax Convention, I'm interested in connecting. So if you're in the room and you're working around the UN Tax Convention within women's rights, please feel free to drop your contacts on the chat and Hazel can be able to reference that. But any of the panelists are open to come in. We also have a question by Mariana. And Mariana wanted to know, from your personal experiences in your work, what would you say is the main challenge concretely in terms of moving towards a rights-based economy or economies? So what are some of the challenges you face within your work, or some of the barriers, and how have you been maneuvering those, and what are some of the pointers you could share on those? Would anyone? Okay, I can see Maria, your hand is up. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Nicole, and what a wonderful panel. Really, like, it's been so good to hear all the interventions. But just replying to Hazel's question, I hope that people are familiar with the UN Tax Convention, Framework Tax Convention, but I guess that many of you are not. So just to say that a couple of years ago, the Africa group, led by Nigeria, tabled a proposal to have the tax negotiations that normally have taken place mainly at the OECD, so the Club of Rich Nations, to have them at the UN, which is a multilateral space where each country have equal vote, right? This has been highly controversial because in terms of the tax negotiations are hugely important for everything that we are talking about, because we need resources, we need economic resources, as we said, to be able to resource, right? We need to be able to raise the maximal available resources. But countries themselves can go so far in terms of raising domestic revenue through taxes. And we see that most of the tax rules are highly beneficial for the rich countries and not so much for poorer countries, right? Much of the tax negotiation actually is a legacy of colonial times. And we see that the colonial powers still hold that power on tax negotiations. So as I said, a couple of years ago, in October, this proposal was put into the agenda for the UN, and we saw that rich countries voted against, but the G77 that represent over 130 countries, most of them voted for it. So it was put on the agenda and they have been negotiating. In fact, they are negotiating right now the terms of reference for what a UN tax framework convention would be. You are absolutely right, Hazel, in terms of like, what would this mean for gender equality, for women's rights? We see that at the moment, this is very high on the agenda, because although this UN Tax Framework Convention is a massive, massive success for people like CSR and organizations who have been working on tax justice for a very long time, the gender equality isn't really prominent, and it's key that we all join forces and we really engage with these issues. At CSR, we have been trying to build bridges and do this cross-movement mobilization, because we think that tax and fiscal justice is not only important for the tax justice community, it's important for women's rights, it's important for climate justice, for debt justice, for everything, and particularly for human rights. And that's why in the terms of reference, we need to include women's rights, because this is key, right? Why are we talking about tax cooperation? Why are we talking about the need to reduce illicit financial flows that cost $500 billion a year, right? Why are we talking about all of this? This has to do with raising revenue, with redistributing resources. It has to do with repricing. It has to do with representation. It has to do with reparations, right? So we all need to be engaging a lot more on tax justice. And I'm really happy to coordinate, and I'm sure that we have some people in the chat as well, that we have been coordinating submissions for these terms of reference. And we are now coordinating another submission, basically linked to gender equality and women's rights. So please do include your email addresses in the chat. Thank you, Nicole, I'm sorry for taking so long.
Thank you so much, Maria. Nelly, I see your hand is up. Please go ahead. Just if you could take 2 minutes. Nelly?
Adelante.
You're muted, Nelly.
Un poco aprovechando este espacio, como mujer quichua, como está pues también en proceso de construcción de la democracia, frente a esta economía capitalista, la economía comunitaria, no sé si quiero dejarla como una declaratoria, algo así, como un petitorio, de que nos dejen de ver como pobres a los pueblos indígenas. ¿Ya? Nosotros no somos pobres, es nuestra forma de vida, lo que repito. ¿Ya? Y nosotros tenemos nuestro territorio. Primero es territorio. Todas las poblaciones están en territorio indígena. La riqueza está en territorio indígena. La riqueza que sale del país, de mi país, Ecuador, está en territorio indígena. Entonces, ¿por qué nos consideran pobres a nosotras, a las mujeres y a los pueblos indígenas? Cuando hablamos de trabajo no remunerado, no solamente las mujeres no tenemos remuneración en los pueblos indígenas, los hombres también, porque son indígenas, no pueden llegar a tener trabajo. Entonces, esa discriminación racista lo tiene nuestro país. Y entonces, en ese sentido, como nos vienen, no es la justicia igualitaria y a nosotros nos hacen ver que somos pobres y cuando tenemos en la pandemia, no murieron la gente quichua, la gente de pueblos y nacionalidades. Mejor, en la pandemia, en plena pandemia, los pueblos indígenas nos disfrutamos. Nos disfrutamos unión familiar, nos disfrutamos avanzando el trabajo en territorio en el campo, disfrutamos sacando nuestros productos al mercado, disfrutamos también de descubrir nuestra medicina tradicional. Entonces, para nosotros la pandemia no fue negativa. Tal vez para la gente que vive en la ciudad fue negativo, ¿no? Y se fueron a los hospitales, murieron. Después, indígenas que fueron al hospital murieron, pero los indígenas que no se fueron al hospital no murieron. Nosotros hicimos la campaña que no vayan al hospital y en el hospital lo vayan a matar. Entonces, ¿y por qué a nosotros nos dicen pobre? Pobre no tengo carro, pobre no tengo casa, edificios, pero tenemos el territorio, en territorio tenemos medicina, alimentación, todo, pero nos hacen ver que nosotros somos pobres. Entonces, esa palabra pobreza, que dejen a un lado de ver a nosotros que somos pobres. ¿Ya? Cuando nos dicen que somos pobres, a nosotros nos hacen ver tan pequeños y mujeres tan pequeñas que no servimos, solo debemos pasar pidiendo. Ni siquiera nos permiten que nosotros expresemos, demostremos nuestro trabajo. Nuestros productos tienen un valor, nuestro conocimiento tiene un valor, nuestra sabiduría tiene un valor. Entonces, y eso es lo que en este espacio como mujer quichua, lanzarla. Y por eso es que aprovechando, agradecer a CEDES Ecuador, que nos está viendo, haciendo reflexionar estas cosas que a veces las mujeres estamos tan cerrados, como nos dicen pobres, y nos sentimos tan pequeñitas y pobrecitas, y no queremos salir de aquello. Entonces ahora que nos apoyen en este espacio y nosotros con el apoyo de CEDES estamos caminando con lo poco recurso que nos dan, nos vamos a las comunidades a conocer la realidad. Claro, somos indígenas, no todas las comunidades vivimos la misma realidad. Entonces, y eso es lo que quiero aquí expresarla y entender lo que a ustedes están analizando académicamente, científicamente, pero expresando nuestro sentir. Gracias.
You are doing from a more scientific level, but I also wanted to express this opinion. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Nelly. And thank you so much to all the speakers who we had today. I just note that that question by Mariana wasn't addressed. And if anyone would like to come in and just take a minute to be able to share some of your challenges and how you've been navigating that as you work around, of course, a rights-based economy or rights-based approach to macroeconomic analysis. Eva, go ahead.
Gracias. Bueno,
Thank
respondiendo a
you.
la pregunta,
To answer
uno de los
this
mayores
question, I
desafíos que
think one of
tenemos
the
nosotros
biggest
acá en
challenges
Ecuador, por
we face
ejemplo,
here in
es
Ecuador
tener incidencia.
is doing it
Incidencia,
together,
obviamente, en el gobierno central, pero
to
nosotras estamos
be able to do
tratando
advocacy
de
with the
incidir de alguna
national
manera
government.
desde lo local,
We are
con
trying
los
to do
gobiernos
advocacy
locales.
with our
En
local
eso, por ejemplo,
governments.
Nelly tiene ya
In this
experiencia,
regards,
es una
Nelly
lideresa
has
ya
some
consolidada que
experience.
puede
She's a
tener,
strong
mantiene
indigenous
reuniones,
leader
digamos, con el alcalde
who has meetings
del
with the
Tena,
mayor
puede
of
tener reuniones acá en Quito,
Tena
pero
or
no
comes
todas
to Quito sometimes for
las mujeres con
meetings,
las que
but
trabajamos
not
tienen ese
all the
nivel
women
de
we work with
incidencia, ¿no?
are
Y en eso es lo
such a
que
high
estamos
profile
trabajando
when doing
también.
advocacy, and that is what we are also
También
working on.
las mujeres nos dicen y están conscientes de que
Women
son
tell us
pocas
and
las que
they're
pueden
aware that there
acceder a
are
los
few
talleres, a
women
veces
who
también
can
obviamente por falta
attend
de
our
recursos.
workshops, sometimes
Nosotros
because we're
llegamos
lacking
al número
resources.
que obviamente nos
We have
alcanza
limitations. We would
lastimosamente.
love to be able to
Pero claro,
get
nuestro
more women to
desafío es
attend our
poder llegar a
trainings. Our
más
challenge is
mujeres.
to
En
reach out to
eso
more women and
estamos
include more women in our
estamos
trainings.
trabajando en que
And we're
las
working on
mujeres
that. We're
que
working
reciben las
to get
capacitaciones
women
puedan ser
who are
voceras en
trained
sus
to then be
comunidades para
spokespersons
que
for their communities
llegue a más voces, ¿no?
so that
Se
they
trata
can
esto también de un
spread
proceso
the message.
multiplicador.
This would have a multiplying effect.
Y eso estamos buscando nosotros ahora
That
y
is
es un
what we're trying
desafío
to
para
do. It's a
nosotras porque
challenge for us to reach
tenemos
out to more
la
women.
conciencia de que
We
muchas veces las
know that very
mujeres
often
no pueden ser
women
parte de estos procesos
cannot
por obviamente
participate in
temas de
these
género.
processes because
En la
of
Amazonía
gender-related
ecuatoriana
issues. In the
tenemos muchos
Ecuadorian
problemas de violencia
Amazon
de
region,
género.
we are faced with
Todavía
a lot of gender-based violence.
a algunas mujeres se les
And
hace muy
some
difícil
women
llegar a las
find it very
capacitaciones porque
difficult to
obviamente
attend
sus
the
maridos
training sessions
no les
because
dejan,
their
tienen que
husbands or
quedarse
partners
cuidando
won't
los
allow them to
hijos,
attend. They have
la
to stay at
casa,
home
etcétera.
looking
Entonces
after the
todavía
house
nosotros
and the
tenemos
kids.
mucha resistencia
So we
con
see a lot
estos
of
temas.
resistance around that.
Y eso, estamos trabajando en eso, en poder incidir en los
So we're
gobiernos
working
locales
on
y en
doing
el gobierno
local
central también,
advocacy.
sobre
We're
todo,
trying
para
to do
que
advocacy
puedan
at a
entender
national
esta
level with the
cosmovisión de
government
la
so that
economía basada en
they
derechos y sobre todo la
understand
economía
the
comunitaria.
cosmovision based on
Nuestro
rights-based
desafío
economies
también
and
es
the
que
community-based
existan
economy.
políticas
Another
públicas de consumo
challenge is to
local.
see
Eso ayudaría
national
muchísimo a las
public policies
mujeres
on
indígenas de la
local
Amazonía que producen,
consumption. This would be very
sobre todo
helpful
trabajan en la
for
tierra,
women
en
from
el
the
turismo
Amazon who work
comunitario.
land and work in
Entonces, un
community-based
desafío sí es
tourism.
que
So
los
another
gobiernos
challenge
puedan apoyar
is to get
políticas
governments
de
to
consumo local.
support local
Eso.
consumption
Gracias,
policies.
Nicole.
Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you for that, Eva. And lastly, Jessica, just 1 minute. I'm conscious of time and I would like to wrap it up just for the guests who are able to join us for the whole session. Jessica?
Yes, very quick, maybe response to how we address the challenges here in Malawi. So with the Alliance, one thing that we have leveraged on is knowledge production, but specifically knowledge production for feminist political education. So we maximize whatever available platforms that we have to disseminate all the findings that we have and attach them to lived experiences. And for us, it's because we want it to be clear that you cannot separate macroeconomics from the women, and you cannot separate the economy from the woman's body across the different diversities. You cannot separate them. And we share this through sharing the different lived experiences. Whenever we have an economic shock, such as the devaluation, we center the experiences of women and how women have been impacted by that and disseminate them across the different platforms. That way, we're reaching more people and we're reaching even more women who also can see themselves in the stories that have been shared. And that goes towards one, dissemination and sharing widely, but also mobilizing and strengthening a movement that
I'm sorry, Jessica. We lost you a bit. But thank you all for such great input and the conversations today, of course, on a rights-based economy. And so I'll just call on Alina. I don't know if you'd like to wrap up.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, our distinguished panelists, for such a great intervention and joining us, especially Eva and Nelly from Ecuador early in the morning, and also our attendees from different parts of the world. We will be following up with the recording and short report of the from the webinar, and continue to keep up this conversation ongoing, and look forward to what other advocacy opportunity would arise with the upcoming IFFE conference in July. So yes, thank you very much for your time, and have a wonderful day ahead. Bye.